As we enter week 10 of the NFL season, it means that we are officially halfway done with the year. But that also means that the fantasy playoffs are just a few weeks away, so you need to reinforce your team and get ready for the playoff push. But with another 4 teams on the bye this week, is there going to be enough players on the waiver wire to help buff your roster? Let's talk about it right now. Headliner Nation, we are rolling into week 10 strong, and we're seeing some players that had a slow start to the season pick it up a little bit, which is great for our rosters. But if you've been waiting to reinforce your roster off the waiver wire, you've waited way too long, because this week is not looking good outside of a couple of people. As always, I've got some running backs, wide receivers, and tight ends that we can add to potentially not only help us in week 10, but for the remainder of the season. Then some quarterbacks and defensive teams that we can potentially stream for week 10, and then maybe some players that we should just drop and forget all about. Let's go ahead and hop into running backs first, and I tell you what, it is looking super thin this week. After running for 138 yards on the ground on only 9 carries this past week, Keaton Mitchell is going to be the #1 overall priority waiver ad for everybody. And considering the fact that there's not many running backs to even take a shot on this week, people are going to be dropping fab on him like crazy. Now, the one thing that I want to just caution you all with, I brought Keaton Mitchell up on this show a couple of times already this season. So if you've been watching, you're probably already familiar with him. But Gus Edwards is going to continue to be the starter and see a bulk of the carries. Keaton Mitchell took over probably the RB2 position from Justice Hill. Now, Justice Hill and Keaton Mitchell saw a lot of work when the game was really already out of control and Baltimore was up by more than 14 points. Gus Edwards is going to continue to be the starter and see a bulk of the carries. Really, Keaton Mitchell and Justice Hill saw the majority of their workload after this game was out of hand. But earlier in the game, when Baltimore was only up 14, Keaton Mitchell was getting a lot of touches over Justice Hill still, even if the majority of his production didn't come until a little later in the game. So really, for Gus Edwards owners, you want Keaton Mitchell. For everybody else that's looking for maybe a little bit of a oomph to your lineup, it's also going to be Keaton Mitchell this week. But once again, even in a blowout, Keaton Mitchell only saw 9 carries and is still going to be in a backfield that will have Justice Hill getting some touches as well, even if Mitchell is taking over as the RB2. Devin Singletary continues to be under 60% owned on a majority of fantasy platforms. In this past week, with no Dameon Pierce, Devin Singletary took over as the starter. But Singletary didn't have that great of a day. The RB performances for Houston this year have basically been non-existent. This team is throwing the ball and throwing the ball a lot. You would hope that with how much they're throwing the ball and how good CJ Stroud is, that they could be a little bit more effective on the ground, and they've been anything but. So if you're adding Devin Singletary, it's only as a backup reinforcement type player that if you have an injury or you need to throw him in last second, you possibly could. But he's not out of the woods as the starter just yet. If he had had a better week against Tampa Bay, then maybe, but Dameon Pierce will still be lurking when he comes back. Now that they have confirmed that Cam Akers did tear his Achilles and he is done for the year, there's going to have to be a new backup in Minnesota. And more than likely, it will end up being Ty Chandler. Now, Kenny Nwangwu will still be there and will probably still get some work over the coming weeks. But Ty Chandler has been listed on the depth chart for a majority of the season as either the backup to Madison or the #3 to Cam Akers. So moving forward, if you own Alexander Madison, because that dude has been anything short of good recently, you're definitely going to want to have his backup just in case, because Cam Akers was starting to take some touches away from Madison, even though Madison was still the guy. If anything were to happen, Ty Chandler would probably be next up. And since there aren't a whole lot of running backs to talk about this week, this is really just a general announcement. This is the time of year where you absolutely want to be hanging on to the handcuffs for your running backs. Now, we're still going to have a couple of weeks left where 4 teams are going to have a bye, and we even have a week left left where 6 teams will have a bye. But you can't let that deter you from making sure that you own the handcuffs to your running backs in case injuries happen and you need to replace them. Especially for those of you that are playing really well right now and you have a low waiver priority, or maybe you've already spent a bunch of fab already. It's really important for you to take weeks like this to add the handcuffs to your starters, because if you don't, and your starter goes down and the guy up is still going to be on waivers, then the people with fab remaining are going to get him over you, or the people with a higher waiver priority will end up getting him as well. Make sure you reinforce your roster, maybe not with high upside play guys, but with safe play guys, so if there's any injuries or issues, you're able to fill in right away. For the wide receiver position this week, we've got 15 guys to talk about, but some of these guys aren't going to be worth a look, especially if you're in shallow leagues. But for those of you playing in deeper leagues, absolutely wanted to include some deeper guys in case you need to make some moves at the wide receiver position. Kyle Phillips caught 4 of his 5 targets for 68 yards on Thursday Night Football. And with Treylon Burks having a nasty concussion and going down hard in that game, we might want to take a look at Kyle Phillips this week in PPR leagues, because coming out of the slot, he could see a decent amount of looks if Treylon Burks is expected to end up missing in week 10. Allen Robinson is just listed as a guy that you're going to want to keep your eye on, because George Pickens took to social media after their Thursday night game extremely frustrated at his lack of usage right now in the passing game. Who knows if there could be any type of disciplinary action coming for George Pickens, and if there is, Allen Robinson would be the number 2 and what is a good matchup this week for him. Jackson Smith-Njigba has 7+ targets and more than 60 receiving yards in 2 of his last 3 games. And with the connection between DK Metcalf and Geno Smith being less than stellar this week, Jackson Smith-Njigba seems to be carving out a bigger role in this offense, even if that role doesn't bring a whole lot of upside. Now that Odell Beckham Jr. is starting to maybe get fully healthy, it's going to be interesting to see if he has a larger role in this offense carved out over the next few weeks. Zay Flowers really hasn't been jumping off the page as of recent, and outside of him, this passing game is wide open except for Mark Andrews getting his fair share of targets. So if OBJ can stay healthy and maybe command some of those targets down the stretch, he could end up being a guy that sneaks into the wide receiver 3 conversation. Darnell Mooney caught 5 of his 6 targets for 82 yards, and it feels like Bagent has been looking his way a little bit more often as of recent. But with Justin Fields definitely getting closer to returning, it would all depend on whether or not he comes back in the next couple of weeks, because we know that Fields really isn't looking towards Mooney the way he is when he looks to either Cole Kmet or DJ Moore. I'm going to go ahead and list Brandon Powell because this past week he did have a big touchdown reception, but a lot of that is going to depend on whether or not Justin Jefferson comes back this week and what the diagnosis with KJ Osborne will end up being, because he was carted off the field. Brandon Powell would be completely a speculative ad, and honestly, you don't even need to use a waiver priority or any type of fab money on him, because we wouldn't need to pick him up until later in the week when we know more information. What about Juju and Demario Douglas from New England? Juju this past week had 7 targets, which was tied for the team lead. And he's definitely looking like a guy that's healthy, back on the field, and ready to show out the rest of the season. And given the fact that Kendrick Bourne is done for the year, Juju could definitely step up and help this offense. But the number 1 wide receiver in this offense will continue to be Demario Douglas. Over 20 targets the last 3 weeks, and clearly the guy that's getting looked at the most by Mac Jones. Isaiah McKenzie for Indianapolis will be stepping up into the slot as long as Josh Downs ends up missing time. And Downs was going to be a game time decision for this week, ended up giving it a go and couldn't go the entire game. So it wouldn't surprise me if they decided to go ahead and pull the strings back and let Josh Downs rest for another week, meaning Isaiah McKenzie could end up being the number 2 in this offense in week 10. Granted, the Giants were playing playing from behind the entire time against Las Vegas. Probably one of the reasons why we saw a decent amount of targets to both Darius Slayton and Wan'Dale Robinson. And I really don't know if you're going to trust either of these guys moving forward, but it was good to see the Giants kind of let DeVito throw the ball a little bit more, which means these guys could end up seeing good target shares. Wan'Dale Robinson ended up catching a touchdown this past week, but the biggest thing with him is his plays on short to intermediate yards. Those are the bread and butter for Wan'Dale Robinson. He doesn't pick up a lot of yards. He doesn't make a ton of guys miss. He catches the ball though, and he barrels forward and gets as many yards as possible. So if DeVito is going to continue to look his way in PPR leagues, Wan'Dale Robinson could absolutely make his way in as a wide receiver 3. Darius Slayton led the team with 7 targets, and because they were taking some shots down the field, Darius Slayton was the guy. This would definitely be a much deeper option for those of you that are just looking for maybe a big playability wide receiver to stash on your bench to use in a good matchup. Khalil Shakir is another slot guy that could see some decent targets over the end of the season here. Right now, he's definitely got a safer floor than Gabe Davis, even though Gabe Davis has the highest upside of anybody on the Buffalo Bills. So when you take a look at Khalil Shakir, who's working out of the slot currently, as long as Dawson Knox doesn't return at the end of his IR stint, then Shakir could continue to see a decent amount of targets and be a PPR option for those of you that need a filler. This video is being recorded before Monday Night Football, and it was known on Saturday that Josh Palmer was headed to the IR. So there may have been a lot of people running to scoop up Quentin Johnston already, and he may not be available in your leagues. But given the outcome of Monday Night Football, if he's still available in your league, because this video will post before kickoff, then I would grab him beforehand just in case he goes off. Noah Brown is going to be a really interesting guy to keep an eye on, because when you take a look at the pecking order right now, it's really a 1A, 1B, 1C in between Nico Collins, Tank Dell, and Dalton Schultz. But Noah Brown made an interesting case to be a big play guy this past weekend. Brown caught all 6 of his targets for 153 yards and a touchdown. This also marks the 3rd straight game that Noah Brown had a reception that went for more than 30 yards. If that continues to keep up with as much as they are throwing the ball with CJ Stroud, Noah Brown could be a really deep add, especially if Tank Dell were to deal with any more injuries throughout the season or Nico Collins were to miss time either. And I want to bring up Michael Wilson one more time, because as of right now, he's not showing a whole lot of fantasy value, but his average depth of target is just over 15 yards, making him the deep play threat. And with Kyler Murray potentially returning this week, it would make sense with him at quarterback that Michael Wilson could be a little bit more consistent down the field. He does have at least 50 receiving yards in 5 of his last 7 games. So with Kyler Murray, we could definitely see a jump up to about 70 if those big plays start to churn in some more production. All right, for the tight end position this week, we're going to kick it off with Trey McBride, and he was definitely a bigger disappointment for those of you that used him this past week. Not nearly the numbers we saw the week before, but Cleveland absolutely held Clayton Tune in check, and there was nothing that he could do. But again, Kyler Murray could end up being back this week, and that would be better for this offense than Clayton Tune. So keep an eye on that. And if Trey McBride is still available on your waivers, he's definitely solidifying himself as the potential number 2 target with Kyler Murray right behind Marquise Brown. Last week, I listed Cade Otton as like a deep play dart throw. If you were looking for something at the tight end position and you couldn't find anybody that you could trust, Cade Otton would definitely be a guy that I look towards. He's playing more snaps than any tight end in football right now, and he had 2 touchdowns this past week. Does that continue? Maybe not. Given the back and forth nature of that matchup between Minnesota and Tampa Bay may not keep up that type of passing production moving forward, which would definitely hurt Cade Otton. But if we could carve out a really nice number 3 role behind Mike Evans and Chris Godwin, then Cade Otton would become fantasy viable. Juwan Johnson caught all 5 of his targets for only 29 yards this week, but he scored a touchdown. And that's where Juwan Johnson makes his money anyway, is in the red zone. Last year, he was one of the best red zone threats in all of football at the tight end position. And with injuries this year and inconsistent play, he just hasn't found it as of yet. But if this week is any indication, we'll be back on board very soon. Jonnu Smith has been dropped in recent weeks because he hasn't really hit his ceiling that people would have liked. And Taylor Heineke doesn't really have a track record at targeting the tight end position. But this past week, Jonnu Smith caught 5 of his 6 targets for 100 yards and a big play touchdown. If Taylor Heineke is going to continue going towards Jonnu Smith, he's got top 10 potential every week as the potential number 1 or number 2 target in this offense. I've been saying it for weeks with Luke Musgrave. We need targets. And he finally got 5 of them this past week, and he showed off that big playability that we've been discussing. But that's the issue with Luke Musgrave. As much as I would like to trust him moving forward, he just isn't getting the volume that he deserves in this offense. Hunter Henry's 7 targets this past week tied for the team lead, and he definitely could be making his way back to Mac Jones's number 1 now that Kendrick Bourne is gone. But he's still going to be very reliant on those touchdowns and being utilized in the red zone. But if New England can continue to move the ball the way they did this past week, then absolutely Hunter Henry will see his fantasy value skyrocket once again. Daniel Bellinger was a guy that I brought up late last week, and I told everybody, if you're looking for somebody to add to your roster, take a flyer on Daniel Bellinger. And he didn't do much this past week, only 3 targets. But if DeVito continues to be the starter and we see a little bit more of a short passing game, high percentage throws to keep the ball in the hands of the New York offense so they don't fall behind and have to play catch up all of the time, Daniel Bellinger with no Darren Waller could have some fantasy value coming up very soon. Maybe not a start right away, but keep his name in mind down the stretch. All right, let's talk about a few quarterbacks that you could potentially stream this week, and nobody is going to want to play Bryce Young after the way he went up against Indianapolis. And while I'll get that, Chicago's defense has allowed the 3rd most passing yards this season and the most passing touchdowns. There's definitely an opportunity for a bounce back performance for Bryce Young this week. And honestly, you're going to get him off the waiver wire for absolutely nothing, because I guarantee you a majority of people in your league are not going to even be worried about it. All right, maybe Will Levis didn't have as great of a performance as he did in his first start this year, but he still looked pretty darn good last week. And a lot of the issues, a lot of the flaws that we saw with him coming out of college, it looked like he's already started working on, which is great for this offense. And now in this matchup this week could definitely be a streaming option for you. Right now, this Tampa Bay defense allows the 4th most passing yards, and it is absolutely plausible that DeAndre Hopkins could break out for a couple of big plays once again. Is Levis going to go for 4 touchdowns again? Maybe not, but the passing yards should at least be there for you. And for those of you out there that still have Kyler Murray sitting on your waiver wire, this week is not a great matchup for him, but Atlanta needs to make a decision. And if they activate him, he definitely could be going this week. And right now, he would be a lot better than some of the other options that are already on the waiver wire. All right, for defensive special team streaming options this week, Minnesota is going to lead the way going up against New Orleans, which might sound really risky to you. And it honestly is. But defensive special teams for Minnesota have scored the 7th most points among defenses this season in fantasy football. So they're doing some things that even though if they give up points and yards, they're still creating turnovers or getting sacks, and that is helping bring you some fantasy points. And we know New Orleans has been a little bit dysfunctional on the offensive side of the ball, which could lead to some turnovers and some sacks of Derek Carr. And if it does, Minnesota could still get you some decent points. The Seahawks are going to get Washington at home this week, and Sam Howell's been pretty darn good over the last couple of weeks. But there has been some times this season where Sam Howell just pushes a little bit too much. And when he does that, it causes turnovers. And knowing how good the Seattle defense has been, especially rookie Devin Witherspoon, those turnovers could play a factor this week. And who would have thought that we would be bringing up the Las Vegas Raiders? Once again, I had them listed as a potential streaming option last week, and I'm going to list them again this week. Going up against Zach Wilson at home, this looks like a renewed team, a renewed vote of confidence, and they feel like they're going to get after Zach Wilson Wilson and maybe cause some turnovers or sacks as well. All right, I've got just a few players that we're going to talk about potentially dropping from our roster. And first up is going to be Josh Palmer. Now, he could end up being back in 4 weeks, which would put him right in that area of returning during the fantasy playoffs. But personally, for me, I'm not going to worry about holding him right now. With so many buys coming up, if I don't have enough room on my IR to stash him, I'm just going to toss him to the side, because if Quentin Johnston plays well, there's not a whole lot of production coming from Josh Palmer the rest of the season anyway. Right before I recorded this video, it was announced that Cam Akers had torn his Achilles and will be done for the season. So if you're watching this video before you've heard that news, Cam Akers is officially done and we can toss him off our roster. Roschon Johnson has been a guy that I definitely have wanted to keep stashed this season, but he hasn't done anything to take over for Khalil Herbert or even Dante Foreman at this point. So when we take a look at Khalil Herbert coming back this week, he hasn't done anything to lose his job either. So Foreman and Herbert should be the guys moving forward, leaving Roschon Johnson as a very distant third down running back. And for Justice Hill, if you've been keeping a hold of him, it's probably time for us to be done at this point, because it definitely looks like Keaton Mitchell is taking over as the RB2. Hill is still going to see a few carries here and there, but the bigger carries are going to be going to Gus Edwards and Mitchell instead. All right, Headliner Nation, there you have it. Like on every episode I have done this year, in the comments down below, keep it short, keep it sweet. But add whoever, drop whoever, and I will tell you in the comments either yes or no. We're gonna bang through them just like that, baby. So if you've got questions, just keep them short, give me the players, and I'll let you know whether or not we're gonna keep them. But for now, I'm gonna get out of here. We've got a lot of research to do for running backs in week 10. I'm gonna go get started on that. Peace out, stay safe, stay healthy, Headliner Nation, and I will catch you on the next episode of the Fantasy Headliners.